So trauma, if you think about it, is that we have a view of the world that is entirely shattered. Our expectations, what we think is going to happen in life, are absolutely shattered. We think, oh, I'm going to be a happily married person with kids, and then you're divorced, or you lose a kid to an illness. These kinds of things shatter us because they defeat our expectations. This is what happened for them. They had an expectation life would be a certain way, and then this terrible crime occurs that entirely shatters their expectations. And people have studied this. And we see this in also the lives of officers who have been critically injured in critical incidents, that they don't think this is ever going to happen to them. And then it does. And now what do I do? And if you stay in that depressed response where you can't get back on your feet, if you stay down there, we call that PTSD. If you just get back to where you were functioning before the incident occurred, we call that resiliency. So here's the key according to secularists, okay? It's something that they call meaning making. Now, it makes sense. Here's why. You have an expectation. Basically, you have a script in your head, a worldview, a way you see the world. This trauma destroys your worldview. The question then becomes, can I reestablish it? Can I rethink it? In other words, can I make sense of this event in the larger story of my life? Is this the last chapter? Or is this just the climactic chapter from which something amazing is about to happen? I have to figure out where this event fits in the overarching meaning of my life. Here's what she basically did. She said, you know what? Maybe I've thought about this wrong. Maybe my worldview as a Christian did not allow for this murder to even be possible. God should have stopped it. Why would a good God who loves my sister allow this to happen to someone who did nothing to precipitate it? How can I even reason that? So we had to spend some time now until she found out that I was a Christian, and we started to walk through why God would allow any suffering. What does God do with suffering? What is the place of suffering in a larger story? What chapter does it fill? And after she was able to kind of re-navigate that, she found herself thriving on the backside of it. And her family started thriving and started finding, we're celebrating holidays again. And then she was married within a year. And I thought, wow, isn't that amazing that life just took off because you had a script for what you thought God does in the world. But the script was wrong from the beginning.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Job's friends. I remember just studying Job at the time. Because, if you look at Job's friends, he suffers twice. He suffers from all the loss, and he suffers from bad friends who have bad theology.
Right.
Right? Because their story isn't correct about how God works in the world with suffering.
Yeah.
And so she just needed to have a story that was actually, a correct story of how the world really works.
But, again, for context, I mean, she had gone 20 years wallowing in this situation, which is, reasonable emotionally when you don't have that bigger story. So I want a little more insight, Jim, with Kelly particularly about how she climbed out of that hole, because it's so instructive to many who are living in that hole right now.
So here's what I basically said. Okay, look. So I can think of maybe 5, 6, 7 reasons why a good God would allow something bad to happen to us. And that's all we have to, and if there's a reason why God might allow it, that would cause you to rethink what just happened. So here's the first one I said to her. I said, look, if there's a God, and if Christianity is true, you have to stop living like you're an atheist. As an atheist, I believed all satisfaction, all justice, all pleasure had to be satisfied in the line segment, that was my geometry, from birth to death. As a non-believer, this is why I thought I had 90 years clean, hopefully. You'd drop dead in your sleep after a big dinner, right? That was the goal.
Yeah.
So you don't 90 clean years. Well, I tell you what, if something happens to you in your 50s, and then you die early, you're going to be upset. That's evil because you expected 90 clean because you have an idea of life that's a line segment. But what if you're wrong about your geometry? What if life doesn't start at birth and extend to death and it ends right there, but it actually goes through that point into eternity? That's called a ray. That's not a line segment. If life's a ray, now everything changes because there are people who had terrible surgeries in their infancy. Yet by the time they were 3, they don't even remember the surgery. All evil has to be measured in the context of your lifespan. So here's what I mean. If the ray is correct, 1,000 years into the other side of the second dot into the ray, that 90 years is really small by comparison to the 1,000. 1,000,000 years into the other side of the second dot, now that 90 years is a millisecond. You could have 90 terrible years. But if the Christian worldview about life is true, God's not interested in your line segment. He's got you for your life. And the minute that ray starts for you is when you accept Christ as Savior.
So in that context, you would say that even as evil is expressed in this life, God will bend that for somebody's good, somebody in that sphere, or many.
So let me say something controversial.
Okay.
Is God ever the author of suffering?
I'm going to let you jump out and suggest what that might be.
Yes. Is he the author of evil? No. When Satan authors suffering, he authors it to destroy you. When God authors suffering, he offers it to shape you, to build you, to give you something even better. And so he will allow us to suffer
for a bigger purpose.
What father doesn't discipline his children? Author of Hebrews says.
But I've got to, okay, in that context, going back, one of the biggest question people will ask is, how can a God that's loving and kind allow a child to suffer and die?
Because that child is not living in the line segment. That child is just like you and I. He's part of the array.
So there's
he's
much
alive
more
right
eternal
now.
life after this.
Yes, he's alive right now. See, we think of death because we think of it as a line segment. That second dot is final for us. But as Christians, we ought to know better than that. One more thing. A good God who's all-loving, I suspect, would want to create a world in which love is possible. How could you call him a good God if he creates a world in which you can never love anybody? But here's the dangerous problem with that. If you want love to emerge in this world, you have to create the thing that love stands on, which is dangerous. It's free agency.
Right.
There is no love without free. I can't put a gun to your head and say, do you love me, John? You'll say, Jim, you'll say yes. John, you'll say yes. But you don't mean it because you're being coerced. It turns out I have to give you the dangerous thing first, the free agency thing. That means you have to have the freedom to hate me in order to truly love me. Oh, so you want that dangerous thing called free agency? Well, yeah, it is logically impossible for God to create a world in which love exists without free agency.
Yeah.
So if you want one, you're going to have, there's no way to create a world in which love exists without free agency. But that means you have to have the true freedom to do something that happens to these victims.
Yeah.
But if life is a ray and not a segment, I got you. I got you. And by the way, all of you unsolved people in crimes, or all your crimes have been unsolved, relax. Because it turns out I don't have to work within the 90 years to get that crime solved either. I don't have to work within the 90 years to satisfy all justice, to satisfy every desire you have. That guy who's stealing to get those things met, it turns out you might become a Christian and never experience all the delight you thought you were going to experience in the lion segment. But it's okay. It's a ray. I got you covered. It's on the other side of the second dot. So as for her, she just needed to kind of get a sense of, like, what would be the good reasons? Look, suffering is necessary to character building. All the things that atheists love the most, courage, compassion, charity, you think those things are a switch you flip? No. They're all responses. They're responses to hardship. You can't have courage without danger. I can't just say, oh, you're courageous now. No, you didn't. It's how you respond to danger that makes you courageous. So if you wanted to develop courage and compassion and charity and forgiveness, you'd have to design a world in which there is danger and suffering and transgression and poverty. These are the things that provoke the responses that actually, even as an atheist, I would have said, yeah, I want a world that has those. But see, what we mistakenly think is I can get that world by just flipping a switch. No, those are things that are absolutely responses to hardship.
Yeah. For that person who is suffering and can't get through this, going back to Kelly's story, that, she hasn't had that encounter yet to think differently, that person is still there. And I'm kind of curious what you think the percentage of people in this life are sitting in that spot. 80% that have had hardship, and they're not.
That's 100%.
Not
the question
able to
is how we
move
respond.
through.
Yeah.
So what do you say that person, Kelly, who hasn't had that encounter with you to get this kind of input, who hasn't received it at a church perhaps, or many of the Christians around her, even being a Christian, have not been able to explain this adequately. What do you say to that person?
Well, first of all, I think we're living in a world right now where almost no one has an excuse to not have information. We're in the information age.
Right.
We've written about it extensively on our website. There's a ton of material right here on the Focus and the Family interviews, podcasts of people who are trying to answer the question, how could a good God allow evil? And that's an important question that we have to answer. By the way, all of us have to explain evil. You think the explanation on the atheist side is any better than ours?
Right.
Do you
It
think it's
should
any
be
more comforting than ours?
right.
Do you think there's
Empty.
any hope in the atheist explanation for the problem of evil? There isn't. We all have to offer a solution. The question is which solution actually comports with the evidence and is the most satisfying. It's the best inference from evidence.
Yeah.
So for me, it's about really, if you are struggling right now, look, there's two ways we struggle with evil. One is intellectual, but the other is emotional. So if you've struggled with evil, my case for why God would allow this is meaningless to you. There's a season in which her family just needed to be held, just needed to be sat with, just needed to be, we call this a ministry of presence. Just be present. You don't need to offer answers. But for your kids who haven't yet experienced evil, it turns out that's the time to inoculate them with right thinking. So there's the intellectual case I can make, but for people who have just suffered evil, I'm not sure how satisfying that is ever going to be. There's going to be a season in which you just need to be held.
Yeah.
But for those who have, if evil is in your rear view mirror, that's a different approach. But if evil is still through your windshield, and that is probably the case for most young people, we need to start talking about these things with them right now, because it can inoculate you from suffering at an even deeper level.